Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life. A series of programs highlighting the social and cultural interaction between the worshiping and larger communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Area Conference of Churches in cooperation with KTBC. Join us now in today's Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue. One of the goals of these programs is to introduce the viewing audience to the richness and diversity of the faith traditions within our Austin community. Our program today will tell the story of a fascinating group of believers living out their faith within the denomination we know as the United Church of Christ. Sharing their faith pilgrimage with us are Reverend James Tomasic, Conference Minister of the South Central Conference of the United Church of Christ. Gail Rust, a lifelong member of Trinity United Church of Christ here in Austin. And our third guest is Paul Tomshany, a retired executive with the Ford Motor Company and an active layperson in a home UCC congregation in Dexter, Michigan. I'm Carl Gronberg, and host for this exploration of the United Church of Christ. And I'm delighted that you decided to join with us. And I want to begin with Jim Tomasic. And Jim, I want you to give us some background, if you will, on the United Church of Christ and the origins of the United Church of Christ.
The United Church of Christ traces its heritage both to the English Reformation and to the German Reformation. Coming in 1620 with the Pilgrims. Most of us learn in history at least about the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth Rock and that heritage, and that's part of who we are, those separatists and Congregationalists who came to this country to find freedom of religious expression. And then we trace another part of our history from the German Reformation, the Reformed Church, which migrated to Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Ohio, and those parts of the country just prior to the Civil War, to the Revolutionary War. And a migration of Germans, again, in the mid-1800s, just before the Civil War, into New Orleans, St. Louis, even into Texas, the evangelicals. And they were a part of a merger in Germany. Frederick the Great brought together the Reformed and the Lutherans into the Evangelical Union Church. Mm-hmm. And so they have both Lutheran and Reformed Presbyterian type in the background.
Let me
the Christian Church came as a result of some activities in the Methodists, the Presbyterians. They formed a Christian church, which is similar to the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, but centered mainly in Kentucky and Vermont and places like that.
I want to draw those out again just so we can have them in our minds. Sure. You have the Congregational group that came mainly to the New England area.
That's right.
And then you have a German group that immigrated into Pennsylvania. And then later came in through New Orleans and went into the Mississippi Valley area, that area, and even into Texas.
Up to St. Louis and over into Texas from Galveston. They embarked in Galveston and trekked across, settled in New Braunfels area.
Right.
1845.
And then the third group that you mentioned,
is the Christian Church. The Congregational Christian was a merger in 1931 of the Congregationalists and the Christian. And the Christian movement was an indigenous movement in this country, which were protests trying to get back to the New Testament style of the early church, and focused primarily on printing and literature and produced one of the first newspapers of any Protestant church in the country.
When you use that word indigenous, you're referring to the fact that they were not an immigrant group necessarily, they were locally
They grew
the
up
U.S.
in
soil.
this country.
Yeah, on the
Grew
U.S.
up in
soil.
this country, yes.
What about some of the main themes of the UCC? Jim, what are some of the things you mentioned, printing and history? What are some of the other themes of the UCC?
Well, the United Church of Christ really is an expression of its major thrust, which is to be a united and uniting church. And the Congregational Christians, who I indicated merged in 1931, and the Evangelical Germans and the Reformed Germans came together, German Reform, came together in 1934. And those congregations or denominations came together in 1957 to form the United Church of Christ. In St. Louis, president of our Eden Seminary and a pastor of one of our large congregational church, Union Congregational Church, got together and started having breakfast and talking about wouldn't it be nice if they could get together. That was the seed that was planted and watered and grew in 1957 to be the merger between the Congregational Christian and the Evangelical Reformed Church.
You mentioned seminaries, so education must be a part of the United Church of Christ. Colleges, seminaries?
Yes, we trace education back to the establishment of Harvard, which was a Congregationalist school that got established in order to educate clergy, basically, essentially. We have historical relationships with Yale and Franklin and Marshall. We have about 40-some colleges and seminaries. We have historically related seminaries that relate to Harvard and Yale and Union and Pacific School of Religion. We have schools in Chicago Theological Seminary, Eden Seminary, Lancaster Seminary.
Locally here in Austin, isn't there a college here that's affiliated with the UCC?
Yes. Prior to the Civil War and right after the Civil War, the Congregationalists were strong abolitionists of the slavery movement and established, following that war, about 500 schools, both elementary, secondary, and colleges. And Houston-Tillotson, the Tillotson side of Houston-Tillotson merger, is a school that the Congregationalists established for the black freed slave.
I'd like to pick up on that and follow a discussion on a little bit about Houston-Tillotson. We've featured them on Austin Faith Dialogue, and their new president has been on Austin Faith Dialogue, but we'd like to reinforce that connection between Houston-Tillotson College and the church as a faith community. Gail, you've grown up in Trinity Congregation of the UCC here in Austin, and tell us a little bit about what have you learned and shared, and as an adult now, what do you value about your faith tradition?
Well, I think I have to go back and value, like Tom was talking about, is the tradition. My parents were both from Austin area, out in the Manor area, and my mother went to a Copeland church, and my father went to a Richland church, about in the farm areas. And both of these churches, I believe, were reforms, and they both changed over to UCC or merge in 1957. And then when my parents were married and moved to Austin, there was a church in Austin that became a UCC, and they helped build that church. So I had more of a family root in the UCC coming from other areas.
When you mentioned the Reformed, and we mentioned before that, when Jim was talking a little bit about the history, he talked about the German element of the evangelical and Reformed. Then your background would have been...
Both are German.
German background.
German backgrounds, yes.
And Jim, how about your background? Is it also a European background?
Well, it's Eastern European. It comes out of Czechoslovakia. Actually, I trace some of my heritage back to the Unity of the Brethren, which is a Moravian movement. John Huss, the burning Bohemian protester, my grandparents were part of the Moravian movement. But when I personally came into the United Church of Christ through the Evangelical and Reform side, when we moved to Lincoln, our family was befriended by people who belonged to that church.
Gail, do they talk about the history that brought together the UCC? When your family talked to you about their home congregation, Trinity here in Austin, did they talk about the fact they came out of rural congregations and now we're a part of this city congregation?
I don't think our church actually talks about it, but I'm aware of it through my parents, and I find it very interesting. At my church, I think some are aware because they are from the outer areas, the farm areas, rural areas.
It would seem to me that'd be a very important value that you could place for the young people in the tradition to make sure they know that rootedness, that background, that heritage.
That's true. I think more need to know about the heritage or the tradition of the starting of the UCC Church. And it's still a very recent merger, and I think it still could be learned, more could be learned about it.
When you talk about 30 years ago, a merger, and I'd say that's recent, I think that's very good, young lady, that you can talk that way. I'd like to hear that. Paul, you, I know a little bit about your background as an active layman in the faith community. You've been raised Presbyterian, you've been a little bit into the Lutheran tradition, and now you're an active UCC layman.
Yeah.
Tell me, as a person who's been involved in corporate community with Ford Motor Company, tell me a little bit about what you found when you moved to Dexter and why you and your wife Gail chose to join a United Church of Christ congregation.
We found a church that made us feel comfortable and warm. It was comfortable with our Presbyterian religion, tradition, family. Being a minister's son, I had some association with various churches along the way. We've had the opportunity to be active in a number of different churches and in various offices, from deacon to elder to president of the consistory now in our local church. I was before that. And one of the interesting parallels, Carl, of names that we were talking about was the original name of our church in Dexter, Michigan, a small community of about 1,800 people, is from the German background, and the cornerstone, which was laid in 1883, which I think is the same time that your church's cornerstone was originally laid up here at 16th and Congress.
Correct.
Our church at that time was a German Evangelical Lutheran Church.
Huh.
And what is now Gethsemane Lutheran Church was at that time Swedish Evangelical Lutheran Church. However, these names came to be along the way. The UCC represented to us a unique opportunity to participate in a Protestant setting. In our community, we have 4 of what I would call mainline churches. Actually, there are 2 UCC churches. One of them is about 5 miles out of town. And we're about 10 miles from that little town of Ann Arbor that does have a basketball team that has some local notoriety. But in our community, these 4 churches have formed together in an ecumenical fashion which really came home to me. One Sunday, I sing in the choir, and the several choirs of the St. Andrew's United Church of Christ, which is our church, and Webster United Church of Christ, the local Roman Catholic Church, St. Joseph's, St. James, which is an Episcopal church, and the local Methodist Church, all have members of their congregation and their choirs join in a local mass march, if you will, and assemble each year at one of the several churches in the community. It came home to me particularly the day that we assembled on the front steps of the Roman Catholic Church. All of these congregations represented by a fairly large number of people, all of the choirs joining together to sing "A Mighty Fortress is Our God."
What a story.
Certainly ecumenical movement personified.
I think that's one of the great strengths that I have sensed in talking with the 3 of you in preparation for this program, that the UCC has historical rootage. Not only that from Europe and coming over here with the immigrants, but there's an indigenous rootage here on the American soil. But there's a spirit of cooperation and ecumenical delight, if you will, in participating with other faith communities and celebrating the goodness of God's grace and all the joys of life. Jim, I'd like to come back to you and ask you another question about today within the UCC, and what are some of the things that are on the horizon, or what's happening today, and what does the future look like for the United Church of Christ?
One of the exciting things for us in South Central Conference is that in June, the General Synod, the 17th General Synod, will be held in Fort Worth. We are hosting that synod, which will bring about 2,000 or 3,000 United Church of Christ people to this part of the country who've not seen the United Church of Christ here. We're a small denomination in the Southwest. South Central Conference, which covers most of Texas and Louisiana, has really only 92 churches and about 20,000 people in a population of some 20 million people. So you see, we're a very tiny minutia within a large C. But we do have a strong affirmation of our heritage in being a united and uniting church. We were born out of merger. We continue to grow in that. We participate in several ecumenical endeavors. This General Synod in June will be acting on documents that have been prepared by the Consultation on Church Union, which has 9 denominations in conversation around a common partnership expression in covenant in Christ. We have a common dialogue going on with the Lutherans and the Reforms. We participate on the Reform side in that. We will be acting on a document that's been prepared for that at this Synod, and also a special partnership with the Christian Church of the Disciples of Christ. So this particular Synod will be highlighting a number of ecumenical thrusts for us, and we look forward to that.
You'll be having this in Fort Worth coming up the end of June, 1st of July, is that what you're saying?
June 29, 4th of July. That's the period of time when we'll be at the Convention Center in Fort Worth, yes.
How does it happen that you and this part of the United States would be designated to host the entire delegation of the UCC coming to Texas? Do they just flip a coin, or how does that all happen?
Well, I think it's by chance in some ways. The person who handles the arrangements likes Fort Worth and found it a good city to meet in, and they liked me, and,
Sure.
and we wrote a letter of invitation, and the invitation got accepted. It's costly. That is going to cost us a little money, and it's also going to cost us a number of volunteers to help host it. But we look forward to it. It'll bring a presence of the UCC to this part of the country that it's not had. The Liberal United Church of Christ, which is what we're tagged by most of the media and most other denominations, will have an opportunity to express itself clearly in Fort Worth this summer.
I want to push you on that a little bit, all right? That Liberal United Church of Christ tag. When you say that, I've got 2 of the lay members of your denomination here, all right? And we're going to push you just a little bit as a clergy. What do you mean, Liberal United Church?
Well, I think we take our manifesto probably from Luke 4, verses 16 to 20, where Jesus tries to outline by quoting Isaiah what his ministry is about, which is to bring release to the captives and freedom, to bring, wholeness to persons. Mm-hmm. And that takes a social mandate as well as a personal faith. And so our motto is we help people grow in personal faith, but also in social responsibility. And that social responsibility involves us very often in social change. And when we get at the issues of social change, where you look at changing the economy or changing the judicial system or changing the legislative system or different ways in which we work and do business, then that begins to touch nerves of folk who are in the establishment.
Do you anticipate in Fort Worth some very exciting times?
Oh, yes. One pronouncement will be on faith and economic justice, and I'm sure that good old capitalism will be in for its share of knocks. And that will be a part of, our dialogue as we struggle to be faithful to what it means to be partial for those who are disadvantaged, which is one of our major threats.
I'd like to come to Gail and Paul to pick up on that in terms of, this is part of that creative tension. Gail, you particularly have grown up in a congregation of the UCC tradition, mm-hmm. and you sense some of that spiritual piety that you've been raised in from Sunday school and worship and family devotions and that type of thing. What does a local congregation like yours, what are you about on a local scene? I hear from Jim Tomasic, conference minister, some of the things that they're talking about on a grand scale. How about, what are you all involved in locally? And what are some of the things you're on the council, is that what you call it?
I'm on the church council, and I represent the Board of Christian Education. And my duties is just to help work getting teachers together to teach Sunday school, lesson plans we will be using, getting the roles, make sure we have enough kids, and just working in the Sunday school. Now, with the UCC work that we do within the Austin area, we are members. Right now we're working on trying to get sponsors for the crop walk.
Right.
And this is a walk against hunger, and it's we do it along with other churches in the Austin area. People will walk and try and get sponsors to collect money, and this helps donate to food and
To the local food bank here in
banks
Austin.
here in
right?
Austin. About 20% is going to be helped here in Austin, and 80% worldwide. Also, we're also included with the Habitats of Humanity.
Oh, yes.
Our parsonage, I believe, is the office area
Yes.
for that.
Been vacant.
Been
We've
vacant, and
using
we
it as an
are-
office.
So what I hear you saying, Gail, is that you are concerned not only with those traditional type things like a church school with liturgy and worship and that type of thing, but you're also concerned about, as Reverend Tomasic has said, you're also concerned about having social concerns, speaking to the world hunger issue, speaking to the homeless issue, the housing issue, that type of
That's
thing.
true. Also, our church is well known through some transients we have come by, because they do know that we do hand out food for them. We have one man that always comes by, he has a little dog, and we always have something, biscuits, and we do have a food pantry for our own church that we do give out to some transients that are able to come by.
Paul, how about up in Michigan? I know your economy is great up there, and you probably don't have these problems we have in Texas,
Well-
but tell me about it. Do you have similar concerns up there?
I say our concerns are very similar, certainly. The interesting thing that I see in the UCC is the diversity, if you will, of the background of the several churches. We participate in an association, as do the churches here, on a voluntary basis. We call it a covenant, if you will. It's an agreement that we meet together for the various purposes that are stated. We have some common purposes and we have some diverse purposes, and the individual church exercises a great deal of autonomy, not only in its own regulation, but also in its own direction and its own local mission. In our case, for example, we're in a growing community. We're served by a relatively limited number of churches. There is a great opportunity for us to provide a warm Christian place for a lot of people who are looking for that and who may come to our doors, and we want to extend them that hospitality and that warmth. And I know a great many of our churches of all denominations are working toward that end. Many of us gained reputations of being very cold, not welcoming the new people. In our case, we're working very hard at it. We're looking at where we should be in the year 2000, for example, in our community. What are we going to need in the way of physical facilities? What will it mean in the way of our ministry? What should we be doing? What direction should we be taking? So while we're involved with the association, with the conference in Michigan, and with the General Synod on a national basis, on a voluntary basis, we're also very interested in the local programs and in working with the other churches in our community.
Paul, what I hear you saying then is that in the United Church of Christ, if resolutions are passed at convention, like the one that's going to be held here in Texas and Fort Worth, the latter part of June, 1st of July, that those resolutions then are recommendations that are not binding on the local congregation, is that correct? But you take them and you seek to implement them as you want to implement them, as you can implement them, is that correct? There's that kind of autonomy of the local congregation?
As a layman, that's the way I understand them and interpret them, and Jim may have a slightly different
Well,
interpretation.
let's see what Jim has to say to that. That's
Well, I think the covenant does permit local autonomy. What we hope most local congregations will do will take those resolutions or pronouncements seriously and discuss them, not ignore them. Well, that is part of what the covenant requires. It isn't that that you cannot make your own decision around a pronouncement or a resolution, but you must take it serious and discuss it and work at it.
If that's going to be taken seriously here in Austin, all right, or in Dexter, Michigan, what's going to happen? How does that implement it? Does the local pastor or council member, such as you are, Gail, or elder, as you are, Paul, do you take them and then set up dialogue within the congregation to discuss peace and justice, to discuss economic change, that type of thing?
We'll try to encourage participation of members of the laity from our churches along with the association and the conference in their discussions as they're preparing for these synod dialogues, and to have inputs into those through the seminars and the workshops that are held concerning those, and to get the viewpoints of the full spectrum of the members of our church. And then, given those inputs, after they have been discussed and further and the dialogue has occurred, to provide an opportunity for feedback to our members so that they can digest them and do with them as they see appropriately.
Paul, if I should move to Dexter, Michigan, and I'm looking for a faith community, a congregation where I can take my family and we can grow, why do I come to St. Andrew's United Church of Christ?
we'd like to provide a warm Christian opportunity, if you will, a family-centered, a family-oriented church, a broad spectrum of ages from very young to very old, but with a rich heritage and tradition of 100 and some years of service in the local community, providing that kind of an opportunity for Christian service. We don't believe, for example, we've looked at Gallup poll information, that the great percentage of Americans at least profess to be Christians, so I don't see us as having to go out and make Christians of people so much as to offer them a place for Christian worship, which suits their needs and which fills the bill for them as Christians.
For appropriating their faith and growing in their faith is what I hear you saying. Let me ask Gail, if I were going to move to Austin, Texas, why Trinity Congregation? What's the reason to come there and become a part of it? Is it like Paul says?
Yes, we do have a friendly atmosphere, and we are a small membership, and it has a lot to do with Paul says. I don't know if I can go into that much of it like he did,
You're there to invite people to worship and to serve. Is that what you're saying?
Right. It's not more of we're not of an outgoing, you know, we want your membership. It's if you feel comfortable and if you feel like it's a place to worship, you're welcome to come, because it is an open worship and open community.
I hear you both saying that one of the reasons you like to be members of UCC is because there's a freedom involved.
Right.
There's not a lot of high pressure and that type of thing going on. Jim Tomasic, what about you? Why the UCC? What's the reason for it to be here if somebody wants to know more about it and come and become a part of the UCC?
Well, I think the UCC, I choose daily to be a part of the UCC, the United Church of Christ, mainly because I think it is addressing the issues of our time that need to be addressed. It offers a place for people to grow in their personal faith and to be socially responsible as we develop as Christians and follow Christ.
Well, I'd like to say thanks to the three of you, and to you who are viewing this program, I'd like to mention to you and remind you that the mosaic of the faith community seems to be always enriched as we grow in appreciation for our neighbor's faith. We hope that you'll keep your eyes open as you drive through our community or other communities for signs pointing to congregations of the UCC, and that you'll have your ears open to listen to the sounds of what I believe are the music of servanthood and faithfulness on the part of the UCC. Jim and Gail and Paul, thank you for coming and thank you for being with us. And to all of you, thanks for watching Austin Faith Dialogue.